This event presents the doctoral dissertation submitted for public examination for the purposes of a doctoral degree in military sciences by Master of Social Sciences Heljä Ossa. Tässä julkisessa väitöstilaisuudessa tarkastetaan yhteiskuntatieteen maisteri Heljä Ossan sotatieteiden alaan kuuluva väitöskirja. The official opponent is Associate Professor Lisbeth Agestam from University of Gothenburg, Sweden. Virallisena vastaväittäjänä toimii apulaisprofessori Lisbeth Agestam Göteborgin yliopistosta. My name is Tommi Koivula. As the custos appointed by the Scientific Research Council of the National Defense University, I hereby declare this public examination of a doctoral dissertation as commenced. Minun nimeni on Tommi Koivula. Maanpuolustuskorkeakoulun nimenä kustoksena julistan väitöstilaisuuden avatuksi. Please be seated. Istukaa, olkaa hyvä.
Honorable Custos, distinguished opponent, ladies and gentlemen. We cannot continue to pay for the military protection of Europe while NATO states are not paying their fair share. This quote is not from Donald Trump, but John F. Kennedy in 1963. As we can see here, the debate on how and how much Europe should contribute to its own defense has continued for decades, since the end of the Second World War, in fact. Throughout the Cold War years, the transatlantic allies tried to improve the divisional flavor between Europe and the US. Still, it took almost half a century before Europeans began to discuss the idea of strategically autonomous Europe more explicitly and seriously. In 1998, the British Prime Minister Tony Blair and the French President Jacques Chirac signed the so-called Saint-Malo Declaration, which stated that the Union must have the capacity for autonomous action, backed up by credible military forces, the means to decide to use them, and the readiness to do so in order to respond to international crises. The Saint-Malo Declaration is often considered the beginning of what we now call European strategic autonomy, and it's also the starting point of my doctoral dissertation. The road that began in Saint-Malo has been long and not a very straightforward. The ideas of strategic autonomy did not receive much attention during the years of international crisis management and the so-called war against terrorism that started after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. It was not until the introduction of the EU Global Strategy in 2016 that strategic autonomy gained more attention in the day-to-day political discussions and in academia. In the past few years, European strategic autonomy has gained a great deal of attention, both among academics and practitioners. But apart from a few exceptions, the focus has been predominantly Eurocentric. As a consequence, the American perspective has been overlooked, and scholarly attention has lacked a more systematic, long-term review on American approaches to European strategic autonomy. It's easy to forget that the European integration project has never been purely European. It has had a strong American influence from the very beginning, and it has always taken place in a transatlantic context. This is what inspired me to study European strategic autonomy from the American perspective. I wanted to better understand how different actors in the American political landscape define and view European strategic autonomy, and to identify aspects that are raised in the US when discussing European and transatlantic defense. Europe that is better able to defend itself, in other words, Europe that is militarily strong and independent, has been seen both as an opportunity and a challenge to the US and NATO. The attitudes of US foreign policy decision makers and foreign policy elites towards European strategic autonomy have varied from support to skepticism throughout decades. Since the late 1990s, it has been repeated again and again that European defense efforts should not decouple, duplicate, or discriminate against NATO. These so-called 3Ds are almost always mentioned when discussing European strategic autonomy. But this is often where the discussion ends. In my research, I wanted to dig deeper and better understand the American debate and its complexity on a more profound level. But what does European strategic autonomy actually mean? European strategic autonomy is a constantly evolving real-life phenomenon that is understood and interpreted in different historical contexts. In other words, the concept and definition of European strategic autonomy is time-dependent. Strategic autonomy does not evolve in a vacuum on its own, but is a social and political construction, an abstract created by people and has no clear starting or ending points. Today, the concept of strategic autonomy is much broader than when it was first introduced some 25 years ago. Nowadays, strategic autonomy is used to discuss issues that are not only related to security and defense, but on broader questions such as energy, trade, supply chains, technology, and digitalization. However, in this research, I narrowed down the focus to security and defense matters. I define European strategic autonomy as an ability to act independently, to set political objectives, and to act upon them either alone or in cooperation with others. Strategic autonomy is not a goal in itself, but a means to reach a more comprehensive target, strengthening Europe's external role and significance in global politics. The ultimate goal of European strategic autonomy seems to be to prevent or at least reduce unwanted dependencies. This is the goal regardless of how broadly or narrowly we define strategic autonomy. I argue that strategic autonomy is not an institution-dependent phenomenon. Strategic autonomy does not only depend on EU initiatives, but also on actions that aim to strengthen the European pillar within NATO. Also, I consider bi-, mini, and multilateral forms of European cooperation to be part of European strategic autonomy. These are, for example, the Nordic Defence Cooperation or the Joint Expeditionary Force. Regardless of the organization or institution, Europe is expected and to an increasing extent also willing to be able to act decisively and independently. In my research, I analyzed two groups that I call political decision makers and foreign policy influencers. The analyzed material consisted of speeches, comments, and statements made by American presidents, secretaries of state and defense, Congress representatives, and key foreign policy advisors. The other set of material was formed of material published by American research institutes, think tanks, and other groups working in the field of foreign, security, and defense policy and transatlantic relations. The research covered almost 25 years of transatlantic relations and European integration. Even though studying such a long period of time posed some challenges, it is also the strength of this research. I do not only present interpretations of our time, but offer a long-term analysis of the topic and take into consideration various points of view. When analyzing the American discussion on European strategic autonomy, it's important to note that the level of debate in the US is different to that in Europe. In Europe, the debate seems to be taking place on the analytical level and conceptual level, and at least until recently, more on the academic level. Only in the 2020s, the debate has gained more relevance within the everyday politics, and as a result, the concept has gained new dimensions. In the US, then again, the debate has been more political for a long time. There is very little discussion of what strategic autonomy actually means and how it should be approached. This observation highlights the reactive nature of the debate on European strategic autonomy in the US. Decision makers react to developments in Europe, which is only natural. It's Europe's responsibility to conceptualize and implement the measures that together form strategic autonomy, not the responsibility of the US. When it comes to US perceptions on European security and defense, previous studies suggest that they appear in cycles. At times, European strategic autonomy is seen as an opportunity, while at other times, a threat. I argue that the different views and attitudes do not necessarily appear cyclically, but coexist and are, in fact, rather permanent. At times, some voices are stronger, and some opinions gain more attention, and support than others. Still, the main arguments when discussing European strategic autonomy have remained relatively unchanged for years, even decades. This is the case particularly among American decision makers who emphasize maintaining the status quo in transatlantic relations. The Clinton administration welcomed the new European security and defense efforts in the late 1990s, but it was also concerned of the consequences to the transatlantic partnership. The administration was particularly worried that the European initiatives would undermine NATO's primacy in the transatlantic security and disturb the alliance's unity. There were also concerns that the new European efforts would result in wasting scarce resources and duplicating already existing structures. The Bush administration then again assumed a more relaxed, laissez-faire approach towards European defense, but highlighted that the need for increased military capabilities. On the other hand, the Bush administration was not particularly optimistic about the possibilities of new European defense developments, and saw them mainly as a backup force to American missions around the world, mainly in Afghanistan and Iraq. During the Obama presidency, European security and defense received remarkably less attention in Washington than before. It's wrong to say that Obama and his cabinet were indifferent about Europe and European defense, but it was simply not a priority for Obama's administration. The foreign policy focus was on reducing American involvement in world crises, which was one reason why the administration welcomed the EU's increased ability to act independently in crisis situations. Donald Trump was very skeptical towards the EU, but his administration took a more diplomatic approach. It emphasized that the US supported improvements in European defense cooperation and welcomed the deepening of NATO-EU relations. All the while, however, the concern for NATO's primacy remained, and the administration highlighted that European initiatives should not put NATO in peril. Today, the Biden administration is a supporter of a stronger Europe, but always remembers to underscore that the stronger Europe should be compatible with NATO. Still, European strategic autonomy has not been a central topic on the administration's busy agenda, even though Europe and the EU have been discussed more than before. A major concern is still maintaining NATO's primacy in the transatlantic security architecture. This is particularly crucial after Russia's attack on Ukraine. As we can see here, maintaining NATO's primacy dominates the debate among American decision makers. As for the other analyzed group, foreign policy influencers, there were much more differing views and opinions on how the US should approach the question of European strategic autonomy. I detected 4 groups among the analyzed influencers. First, America as a European power category was one of the biggest groups that I detected from the material. Policy influencers in this category emphasize strong American engagement in European security and defense through NATO and continued US leadership in the alliance. They had the most negative views about European strategic autonomy and saw the lack of real, credible capabilities as one of the biggest obstacles to achieving European strategic autonomy. The second category was European-led NATO. Compared to others, this category was very marginal, and only a few commentators discussed options related to it. The category combined 2 basic principles: maintaining NATO's role as the primary defense solution for Europe while gradually reducing the US presence in Europe and eventually withdrawing it altogether. What the outcome of this would look like in practice would be NATO led by Europeans with minimal or no US involvement. Such a scenario is, however, rather unlikely and does not seem to be the preferred option of either the US or European powers. The third category, the autonomous Europe, consisted of mostly liberal analysts and commentators who advocated for continued US engagement in European security and defense, but also encouraged Europe to look for more autonomous ways to arrange its defense. Some even saw the European ability to act independently without the US as highly necessary and urgent, and encouraged Europe to take concrete steps towards strategic autonomy. This category was small and rather marginal in the bigger picture, and only a handful of policy influencers, although very active ones, advocated for such a policy. Finally, the lightest possible US footprint category supported European defense initiatives while advocating for reduced US presence in Europe and eventual withdrawal from the old continent. The lightest possible footprint would encourage Europeans to achieve self-sufficiency in security and defense, and in practice, the lightest footprint would mean reducing troops stationed in Europe and making institutional changes within NATO. The US has long been balancing between Europe, wanting Europe to take more responsibility of its own security and defense, and fearing of Europe assuming too much power. There are those who would gladly see the US withdraw from Europe militarily and encourage Europeans to take care of their own and regional matters, but also those who warn of the negative consequences of such a move. The line between too much and too little responsibility is very thin, and there seems to be no shared understanding in Washington on what would be the right amount of strategic autonomy. This is something Europeans should keep in mind. Even though the US decision makers' approach towards European defense has been relatively stable in the past decades, it's possible that this will change in the increasingly biased and confrontational American political landscape. It's unlikely that European strategic autonomy becomes a central topic in the already historical elections later this year in the US, but the future of transatlantic relations and the US role in the world may be brought up. Europe needs to be ready to listen to nuances and indirect references to European strategic autonomy and prepare for changes in Washington. Regardless of who sits in the Oval Office, Europe is expected to do more in the upcoming years. European NATO allies need to increase their defense spending, strengthen their capabilities, and build up defense industry. As for the EU, the Union needs to further clarify its role in European security and defense, and especially in relation to NATO. This work has already begun in the EU Strategic Compass, but there is still a lot to do. As long as the internal European division of labor in defense is not clear, Europe cannot expect the US to welcome ideas like European strategic autonomy with open arms. I call upon you, distinguished Associate Professor Lisbeth Aggestam, as the opponent appointed by the Scientific Research Council of the National Defense University, to present such comments on my dissertation as you deem appropriate. Thank you very much.
So it's a great honor to be here in Helsinki and the National Defense University to discuss Heljä Ossa's doctoral thesis, a work that examines a critical and timely topic within the field of strategic studies and international relations. At a time when Europe faces unprecedented security challenges, particularly in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, understanding the evolving dynamics of European security and defense integration and transatlantic relations is more crucial than ever. This is especially true given the recent changes in the defense policies of European countries like Sweden and Finland, both of which have now joined NATO. So the theses under review in this public examination provide valuable insights into how the United States perceives these European developments and transatlantic security defense relations. The thesis addresses a significant and underexplored problem. How do key actors within the US political system, both decision makers and foreign policy influencers, perceive European strategic autonomy and defense integration? While there is a wealth of European scholarship on these topics, Research that systematically explores this question over a long period of time is relatively small. So by filling this gap, Ossa's thesis makes a substantial contribution to our understanding of the complex dynamics shaping transatlantic relations in the fields of strategic studies and international relations. Grounded in the theoretical framework of neoclassical realism, particularly the work of Ripsman, Taliaferro, and Lobel, the thesis argues that systemic level factors in foreign policy are critically mediated by domestic variables, such as the perceptions of decision makers and societal interest groups. The research employs a qualitative and inductive approach, systematically analyzing a rich range of primary source materials, including speeches, statements, documents, and reports over a 25-year period. Through a thematic content analysis, the study identifies patterns of meaning that shed light on the evolving US perceptions of European strategic autonomy. The empirical study is rigorous. By combining a historical overview of transatlantic relations with a detailed analysis of American perceptions, the thesis generates some important findings. While there are differences in views between decision makers and policy influencers, the dominant concern surrounding European strategic autonomy is its implications for NATO, rather than a fear of Europe directly balancing the United States. So to conclude, this thesis not only deepens our understanding of a pivotal issue in contemporary international relations, but also offers valuable perspective on the future of European-US relations in a rapidly changing global security landscape. This was my opening statement, and I now would like us to proceed and go through the dissertation in more detail. So, before we start the discussion of the thesis, I want to inform the audience that Heljä and I have agreed on informal ways of addressing each other. The structure of the questions I will raise will start with more general academic questions about the research problem, theoretical framework, and research design and methods, and then proceed with a more detailed discussion of the empirical study and the results. And once I've concluded the scrutiny and discussion of this thesis, I will deliver my concluding overall assessment and statement of the dissertation and Heljä's performance in the public examination. So, let me start by saying how much I enjoyed reading this dissertation and how much I learned from it. It's not every day that you get to read a thesis that feels so relevant to current debates when there's such fast-moving European developments in the European security and defense landscape, but also, of course, with the upcoming US election, when the pressing question many people ask, at least on this side of the Atlantic, is how the next US president will look upon American involvement in Europe and prioritize transatlantic relations and the defense commitments through NATO. So reading your thesis has given me a much greater understanding of how past and present US decision makers and policy influencers perceive European strategic autonomy beyond the presentationism of presentism of current politics. So, a PhD thesis is a work of many years. So I want to begin by asking you, Heljä, how and why you decided to work on this topic of American perception of European security and defense integration.
First of all, thank you for your kind words. I'm glad to hear that it wasn't a horrible burden to spend your summer reading this.
Great summer read.
But why did I choose the research topic? I chose it for two reasons, one more personal and one more scholarly. First of all, I've always been very interested in transatlantic relations. I find them very fascinating, mostly because the US and Europe, they're kind of intertwined by shared history, shared culture, to a certain extent language. Sometimes they have been pulled together very closely, sometimes they have been pulled more far away from each other, and there have been political conflicts, but there have also been alliances, even friendship between Europe and the US, and of course individual European countries. I think it's very interesting that throughout the decades, the transatlantic link in a way continues to be one of the most significant kind of embodiments of international relations, and it's a very unique relationship, and its impact on world politics has always intrigued me. So that was mostly the kind of personal reason why I wanted to study this topic. But a more scholarly reason why I wanted to study this is because, like you said in your opening remarks, there is quite a limited amount of prior research on this. So there was clearly a gap in research which I wanted to fill, and especially from a non-European perspective, and offer a more long-term systematic review on American perceptions of European strategic autonomy, and more generally also European security and defense integration.
I think this combination of the personal and the sort of academic interest is often a very good driving force in a PhD project. So I'm very pleased that you combined the two in your answer here. Now, I want to ask you about the sort of scientific positioning of your research. So what disciplines do you see your work primarily contributing to, and why?
It mostly falls within the scope of strategic studies, but of course it also has a lot of elements and aspects of international relations. And this is not a problem in my opinion, because strategic studies and international relations have always lived together in a way and been in conversation with each other for decades really. So, and also as for strategic studies as a discipline, I see it as an kind of independent discipline of its own right that adopts aspects from international relations, but it does not depend on it. But yeah, like I said, it adopts some aspects of it. And why did what makes this research a strategic study is that the level of analysis in the research is on a state actor, so the US, and well, in this case, I consider Europe or the EU to be kind of a state-like actor, so they can be analyzed on the same level. And also because the focus in my research is on the military or the security and defense aspects of strategic autonomy, so that's also why it kind of naturally falls within the scope of strategic studies.
Thank you. Yes, I would agree that the thesis contains a very elaborate, I really appreciate the way you discussed. I had to actually really look up what is the core features of the discipline of strategic studies, because I come from a department of political science. I work in international relations. So it was I really enjoyed reading about how you positioned your work, how it overlaps, but also what the distinctive issues are. So I'm glad you elaborated on that. However, there is one sub-discipline within international relations that I was a little bit surprised it's not really mentioned much in your thesis, and that is the field of foreign policy analysis. Now, I'm an editor of an international journal called Foreign Policy Analysis, so I'm perhaps a little bit biased here, but I also do think that your work speaks to that field. Your ambition is to open up the black box of the state and look at different actors in the foreign policy system, and the focus on the role of perception and domestic state-level factors in foreign policy making are really central areas of research also in the field of foreign policy analysis. But you do not refer much to that in your thesis, and can you elaborate on why that is?
Yes. In fact, I did write about 2 pages about foreign policy analysis, but I never included in the final version of the dissertation.
Why?
That's a very good question. I think I needed to narrow down the page number of the theoretical chapter, and I decided that I will focus on the neoclassical realism and not expand the scope of the chapter too much. And the reason why I didn't choose foreign policy analysis as my theoretical framework, which I suppose I could have done, is that in foreign policy analysis the focus is more on the individual level, if I've understood correctly, whereas I wanted to have the systemic level of international relations as my starting point. Of course, I also studied the domestic level or the unit level, the state level, but the analysis in a way starts from the systemic international level, and it's related to the question of why do we need strategic autonomy in Europe? Well, that's because there are powers and forces in the international system that forces Europe to become more independent. We have aggressive Russia, we have the rise of China, other global events and phenomena that in a way forces Europe to change its attitude towards strategic autonomy. So I think within this in mind, the foreign policy analysis, which focuses more on the individual and even psychological level to a certain extent, it would not have been the best option.
I mean, foreign policy analysis deals very much with the sort of different levels of analysis. So it does actually include the international, but it is distinctive from international relations more generally, which concerns the international system, to really look at the state. But it's actually the interaction. So in a way, neoclassical realist analysis, which we will discuss later, sort of can fit into that, because it opens up to that kind of interaction and the discussion about that.
Absolutely, and it's kind of like a bridge between foreign policy analysis and this kind of neorealism, kind of waltz-in neorealism.
Yeah. So we might come back a bit to the sort of theory side of things a bit later. Now I want to move on to the research questions. You formulate 5 research objectives at the start of the thesis. Can you expand on how you arrived at these, and whether these, because there are 5, changed in the course of conducting your research?
Yes. Well, originally, when I was preparing for this examination, I checked my original research question in my research plan. I think none of them are included in the final version. So it's really, they have changed a lot. Originally, I focused quite a lot on the concepts of balancing and bandwagoning. I discussed them briefly in the final version as well, but I quite soon realized during the literature review that it wouldn't bring me much further. It would maintain the discussion on a quite narrow level in a way. So that's one thing that changed quite a lot. Also, I noticed that many of the original research questions that I had they were not neutral enough. There were quite a lot of underlying assumptions. For example, I formulated one research question so that I kind of assumed that the US has a negative view on European strategic autonomy, and that's of course not a good starting point for a research question because it already narrows my thinking too much. So in the new version, I made them more neutral and with the idea that I have to allow the analyzed material to speak for itself, and I cannot impose something on the material myself.
Because research questions, they sort of can be formulated in different ways, and I appreciate you elaborating on how you arrived at those. But traditionally, it's often done either through conducting literature reviews, finding gaps that needs to be addressed, which you have done, and from which you then formulate your research questions. Or they can be much more derived from theory, so they're sort of more analytical questions. And perhaps your suggestion of this with bandwagoning and balance was more theoretically derived. Now, if you were to choose between those two, I suppose you would land in the one based more from the literature reviews. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. There are some kind of theory-related questions here as well. For example, the third one, there I talk about the US decision makers and foreign policy influencers. So you can already see there that the neoclassical realism kind of, there's something in the background there. But yes, absolutely. The questions are more written after the literature review, or the original first literature review.
The first literature review, right. Because the formulation of questions are rather descriptive. They ask, and encourage a sort of descriptive answer to them. And I wonder, did you not consider at some stage in the research process of going one step further and asking the why questions? In other words, why US decision makers and policy influencers hold the views that they do on European security, on European strategic autonomy?
That's a good question. It's true. I don't have any why questions here. Maybe it's mostly because I wanted to understand the phenomenon, not so much explain. I think the why question would force me to explain to much more, and the how questions refer to understanding, and I have the understanding approach rather than explaining, because I'm not offering any truths here. This is my interpretation of the material and data, which is of course based on systematic analysis, but it's still my interpretation, and maybe some other researcher may get different conclusions.
Maybe we'll come back to this with explaining and understanding, but you say that already at the stage when you formulated your research question, you had already adopted this inductive approach. It was not something that you were thinking about considering the why question, because I'm a believer that academia is not about truths. It's only we have better and less good explanations, and that's what drives academia in a way.
Yes.
So why questions, I think, can also be very relevant to take that extra step of understanding why they hold a particular view. Good. I now want to move on to previous literature and the gap.
Yeah.
And my next question concerns the literature reviews, because you do several. You really have read a lot of literature, you cover a lot of literature.
Oh, yes.
It's a rich source of references there in this thesis on both European integration in security and defense and the transatlantic relationship. And I wonder if you can elaborate on why you think more systematic, long-term studies of US perceptions of European security and defense integration has been overlooked in the academic literature, given the critical importance of the United States to European security?
That's a very good question. I think it has something to do with the fact that most of the research or analysis on European strategic autonomy, sometimes even from the US perspective, it has been done by research institutes and think tanks here in Europe. And if you work in a research institute or think tank, you probably don't have what I call the luxury of spending 4 years doing one research. You have to be much faster and write very concise reports and briefs that can be used in that moment for politicians and civil servants and so on. So that's probably one reason why the research, like this kind of more long-term, more profound research has lacked. We lacked that so far. I would say that's the main reason.
But if you think about, I mean, the luxury of being an academic is that we have this sort of ability, not just as a PhD. I mean, that's a particular moment in your academic career where you can really drill down and examine a problem. But, you know, generally in academia, we do have this sort of longer time perspective. And I mean, there's been a lot written about US foreign policy generally. So why do you think there was a gap on this one, which seems to be the one issue which is a really critical one when it comes to the US role in Europe?
One reason might be that in the US, the explicit discussion on European strategic autonomy is still fairly new, which is I also discuss here in my dissertation, is that they usually talk about European security and defense in different terms. They may not use the word European strategic autonomy, and then perhaps it's still a bit unclear in the US what it actually means, so it's also really difficult to research it if you don't really have anything to grasp on, and kind of a theoretical or like conceptual starting point is quite difficult. So that might be one reason why even in academia people have not done so much research on it yet. Also because there are so many other things within transatlantic relations to study, like NATO's burden sharing discussion, which the Honorable Kustos and I have written about. So there are so many aspects. So perhaps this one has just didn't seem important enough until quite recently.
But how does it compare with that? Because you leave out one very important part of the transatlantic relationship, and I think also in terms of understanding European strategic autonomy and US reactions to it, you are not including European industry and policy, which is of course a major issue of contestation in transatlantic relationship.
Yeah, you mean defense industry?
Yeah, sorry, defense industry. And so is that field more covered academically than this sort of more narrow looking at European strategic autonomy? Is that a bigger field of study? Because there really is a very manifest tension in the transatlantic.
That's true. That might be the case, but it's also interesting that within the material that I analyzed, defense industry didn't really stand out. I was quite surprised actually that it was not discussed that much, and that's also one reason why I'm not really talking about European defense industry in the dissertation, because like I said, I wanted to let the material speak and not impose anything on it. So that's why it may seem that I completely ignored European defense industry, but it didn't really come up that much.
Yeah.
Which was also quite a surprise to me.
Yes, very interesting. Now, while I think you demonstrate extensive knowledge in your literature reviews of transatlantic relations and the US role within it, I wonder why the theses do not also include a broader academic literature review of how the US role in foreign and security policy has been studied more broadly in academic scholarship. And here I'm thinking of major debates in international relations from liberal, realist and constructivist theoretical perspectives. Also thinking of key works on US leadership, power and hegemony, for instance by Robert Keohane, Joseph Nye, Gordon Friedrich published a very interesting book on US leadership from a row theory perspective recently. And they all seem very relevant in trying to understand US perceptions of its role and the responses to European security and defense integration.
You're absolutely right, that's true. I maybe could have or should have expanded the literature review to that. I'm afraid that my reason for that is very practical, trying to keep the chapters and the whole dissertation within a certain length. I do consider some of the theoretical discussion in chapter 6, I believe, when I discuss the grand strategies of the US. So that maybe doesn't cover all those aspects that you mentioned now, but I'm trying to expand the literature review there a little bit and the theoretical aspects of US and transatlantic relations.
Yeah. No, I mean, there I think it could have benefited from having been included. I mean, that's a very good literature review you do on US grand strategy, but it's also very anchored in the various grand strategies of the United States. But obviously, grand strategy is about this kind of expression of world views and how you see relationships, and above all, the US role in the world and its leadership, which is a very foundational idea about US foreign policy, which all US presidents always make reference to. And in your text, when we come to the empirical analysis, there you reference US leadership quite a lot. So I think it could have actually been quite a good contribution to your dissertation.
I'll write an
so
article
if you
about it.
Yes, exactly. I was going to say, now when you're planning to turn this into journal articles, that's something I would include to really pitch that part of it. Okay, I now want to move over to theory, which we have already started to talk a little bit of, but and to talk about the theory that you use in the thesis, neoclassical realism. And while I'm sympathetic and can see why you would want to use it, I would like to know why you chose this particular theory and why you considered it the most important, given that we have a range of different theories to choose from in political science and IR and strategic studies.
Yes. Well, because foreign policy, it's often considered to be above the daily domestic politics, especially in neorealist literature. But I think that's not really the case. But that the demands on the domestic level kind of define the boundaries of the state's foreign policy. So I think it's not possible to think of foreign policy and domestic politics as completely separate entities. So that's one reason why I chose neoclassical realism, because it allows me to combine foreign policy and domestic politics. And basically what happens in the domestic American politics has an impact then on the transatlantic relations, more broadly on European security and or European politics, even global politics. So that's why I think it was justified to study the internal debate within the US to form an understanding of how the US kind of positions itself within the transatlantic relations and how it sees European security and defense politics.
Did you, in the early stages of your research, have any sort of rivaling theories that you were engaging with and that you considered at some stage?
I did consider also grounded theory, but one of the reasons why I did not choose that is because it has kind of a funny approach to literature review. Basically, the grounded theory argues that you shouldn't do a literature review prior to analyzing the material, and I found that quite, weird, to be honest. And I thought that I have to have a literature review, for example, on the concept of European strategic autonomy, so kind of to make an understanding for myself what it means before I start analyzing it from the US perspective. And also, I wanted to have a literature review so that I could narrow down the topic, narrow down the studied or analyzed material. So that's why grounded theory was not really an option in the end. Even though I do have some aspects of grounded theory in my analysis in the empirical work, for example, so that I had the first reading of all the material, and then I added something to it when I noticed that there are some gaps in the data. So it was not like I had a chunk of data that I started to analyze, but I took new elements and included them, which is one of the aspects of grounded theory.
I mean, grounded theory is a very different type of theorizing than using neoclassical realism. I mean, grounded theory is really more about theory development, while neoclassical realism is a much more deductive approach, assuming and exploring certain interaction between different types of explanations. So you, in a way, went from a very one quite specific position, but perhaps this is your sort of inductive, your attraction to adopting that kind of research design, but to this more, I would argue, deductive approach to theorizing.
Yeah, absolutely. I honestly, I cannot remember what I was thinking in 2020. Probably there was something exciting about grounded theory. That's why I considered it, but quite soon just abandoned it.
Yeah. And you never considered using competing explanations, or you're not doing strict explanation, but sort of theoretical framework that offers two different types of understanding these sort of perception of policymakers. Sometimes that can almost generate very interesting results, because that way you can also capture some things that fall outside one particular theory, because theories, of course, are always like glasses we use. I mean, they illuminate certain things. So the decisions we make about theory are so important. So was that something that you ever considered?
To be honest, no. I did that in my master's thesis. I looked at realism, liberalism, and constructivism, and quite honestly, I was quite done with that approach. So I wanted to focus on just one this time.
Yeah.
Maybe in my next PhD.
Yes. Yeah. Very good to remain open about.
Don't worry, people. I'm not going to do this again.
And it, of course, always depends on your research problem. I mean, theory and how you phrase your research questions are intimately linked with each other. So I would therefore just want you to be a bit more precise in describing your type of theorizing in your dissertation. In other words, what purpose does theory serve in your thesis?
It serves kind of two purposes. Firstly, it helped me to create a theoretical framework and to narrow down the scope of study, and most importantly, narrow down the studied material where I actually did the empirical analysis. And that's basically the two groups that I analyzed: the foreign policy decision makers and then the foreign policy influencers. I used only two intervening variables. I did originally consider using all the four that the Tagliaferro and Ripsman were there, three gentlemen writing there. I tried to include all the 4, but I quite soon realized that it was just too much, and especially the other 2 groups, the strategic culture and domestic institutions, they didn't really give me anything extra, so it was kind of enough to study just the 2 groups and have 2 intervening variables there. Yeah, I think that was the most important part of the theoretical framework, or what new classical realism offered me.
Yeah. I'll come back to the 2 intervening variables, but let me press you a little bit more on the theory, because your dissertation contains, I would say, a very insightful discussion on epistemology and ontology. In other words, both how we consider how we view the world, the tools we use for understanding complex phenomena. And as I said, you have this sort of quite long discussion on these questions at the beginning of the thesis. And also a very elaborate and I think excellent discussion on the traditions and then development of neoclassical realism that has become a very popular, I would say. I mean, we've certainly seen in my journal quite a rise in number of journal articles looking at this. Particularly also, as you found, the attraction of trying to understand, particularly foreign policy change, and how systemic level factors are sort of filtered through these other intervening factors. But I was a little bit surprised that the theory provided so little guidance in the construction of the research design and also in the interpretation of the findings. It's not really present in those parts, and so I would be very interested to hear you elaborate on the choice you made in not including that in those very critical parts.
Yes, I completely agree with you, and that's, I admit, it's the weakness of this dissertation, especially in the concluding chapters, that neoclassical realism is not really there anymore. And I did try to include it more into analysis and create some kind of a connection or dialogue between my analysis and the theory. But honestly, it was quite a difficult task. And I think in the end, when I really started to pay attention to this, I probably would have needed to change the basic structure of my research quite a lot to be able to incorporate the theoretical discussion in the analysis and the conclusions as well. So, yeah, I admit that it's not ideal at the moment, but I did recognize the problem.
Yeah, because how I interpreted it then is that you use the theory in a way to identify what you want to study in your dissertation, but it's not really used as a tools of analysis, which
that's true.
Quite often how it's sort of used, because then you keep returning. It's an interactive process between, doing the research and keeping these kind of theoretical considerations in mind and helping that also inform the research design. I always normally tell my students that why do I love theory? Because it's an easy way to sort of, politics and international relations are very complex, and theory is so beautiful because it helps us not to tell the truth, but to lift out the essential features that we want to study and see the interaction of. And that's how I sort of see theory. So that's why I was missing that a little bit in your thesis. But let's us now return to this question about the 2 intervening variables that you focus on in your study. And I think, this is a contribution. You say you modify the theory of neoclassical realism as it's developed by Ripsman and all. and you select to focus on two categories. So it's the foreign policy decision makers and it's the foreign policy influencers. Now, the study of decision makers is obviously relevant and I think fairly straightforward choice. But I want to ask you a few questions about how you conceive of the second group that you call foreign policy influencers. If you could discuss why you landed in that. I mean, you have included them in the group which they discuss, which is basically societal interest groups, and you see them as part of that, but you make a more narrow focus on these foreign policy influences.
Yes, I wanted to include this group because of, there's a phenomenon in the US, probably in other countries as well, but especially strong in the US, this revolving door phenomenon, which means that people from the government often change to the think tank world or research institutes after their careers in the government, and vice versa. Sometimes experts from think tanks are invited to the government, especially during transitions of power. And these people and institutions have a lot of influence, especially in the US, and they're really relevant actors in the US on every policy field, but of course now I focus on the foreign policy and security and defense aspects. So that's the reason why I wanted to include them, and also because I studied about 10 different research institutions and think tanks. So it allowed me to have a very broad overview of the different kind of factions within the society, from liberal to very conservative, isolationist influencers. So it was really interesting to see the kind of broader discussion within the society or within the elites, not just the foreign policy decision makers whose views are often quite predictable in a way and very status quo oriented.
Yeah, excellent. I still wonder, I mean, they are a very specific group, and I can see, I think you justify that very well, why they are important, and particularly in the American context, I think. Nonetheless, there are other domestic actors that are very important in this setting that, from a neoclassical realist perspective, are also discussed. And the one I'm particularly thinking of, and you do discuss it a bit in the dissertation, is the US Congress, which clearly plays a more direct role, I would argue, in US security and defense policy. Certainly has played a role also now when it comes to this whole debate about whether the United States and the US president could make a decision to leave NATO, that it has to go via Congress, which I think really illuminates this. And also why it's important to look at that domestic perspective is that it really brings in the domestic settings. You could argue that some of these foreign policy influences are part of the international elite, but these are politicians anchored in the domestic setting of the United States. And I mean, you mentioned at the end of your presentation of your thesis the increasing polarization that has taken place in the United States. And there is clear evidence in many opinion polls now among politicians on the Democratic and the Republican side that the sort of bipartisanship that existed historically on transatlantic relationship is now fraying. And the way in which they think the links across the Atlantic are important, and NATO and so on. So why not using the Congress and bringing in the party politics? I mean, that would have been, if you're interested in the domestic setting as a sort of intervening variable, I would have thought that's quite interesting, and also vis-a-vis the executive government and the decision makers there.
That's a very good point. I do include for example, Congress and Senate hearings within the decision maker category. But it's true, I don't use it as a kind of separate entity or separate intervening variable. It certainly could have been an option. And now I'm thinking maybe I could continue to research at some point and do that.
Research.
One reason is also that at the beginning of the period that I analyzed, the 1990s, early 2000s, especially the foreign policy of the US was more stable in a way. There were not that many differences, so it was quite bipartisan back then. Now, of course, we see some different, new developments. I still think foreign policy is one of those policy fields that is there's still a chance for bipartisanship, but like you said, it's trailing. So that's another reason that I thought I couldn't find that many differing views, especially in the early stages of the debate in the US.
So I want to then just go back a little bit again to the foreign policy influences. I mean, they are people and individuals working, as Heljä has described, in research institutes, think tanks, but also other interest groups, which you don't really define. Not quite sure what those other interest groups are, but at least they're in the field of foreign and security and defense policy. But you see these as two, the decision makers and foreign policy influences as two intervening variables. But is the category of foreign policy influences of that weight that you have of the decision makers? And how do you see these two intervening variables interacting in your analysis?
I'm not sure if they are of similar weight or importance, but the influencers really do have an impact on decision making. Of course, some of them are not very relevant at other times because, for example, during democratic administration, I'm not sure how much they listen to very conservative thinkers. So it changes who have influence and who have kind of power on the decision makers. As for their interaction, I do admit that maybe I'm not bringing it up that much in my dissertation, but for example, there was this letter that I referenced, I can't remember the women who wrote it, but they addressed it to Federica Mogherini, the EU High Representative. And I think that's one example of the interaction, that there has been development in the US. Also the official decision makers, they reacted to it, and then the influencers try to impact the kind of developments or events that are ongoing in the real foreign policy arena in a way.
I think that's a really fascinating topic, and one that I would really encourage you to pursue in future research, and that you are, it's a little bit inconsistent in your dissertation. In the beginning of the thesis, you raised my expectation a little bit because you were talking about them as influences and impact on policy making, but then actually you're not really evaluating. And I suppose that kind of work would involve almost a process tracing of policy proposals and so on, and see how influence sort of happen. But I think that's one thing that could have been a bit more expanded. It could have really been a contribution, also tying together your ambition to modify neoclassical realism, bringing in these particular type of society groups. It could have been a sort of conceptual contribution that you would have offered in this thesis, which I think is a little bit of a pity that it wasn't expanded a bit more, even if you couldn't have done the full, perhaps in-depth analysis. And I'm really interested in this sort of literature. I mean, in America, this topic of interest groups, the role of interest groups in foreign policy is quite large and quite diverse, because it depends very much on which kind of interest groups we're talking about. We might talk about, I mean, we talked about defense industry. That's obviously one lobby group. We got, ethnic diaspora groups. That's a big topic in America. It's been a very heated academic debate on that one. But also NGOs, how they play a role in this. And I just wondered, did you look at any of that sort of literature on interest groups and the role in foreign policy? And is there any literature really on think tanks as an interest group and the role they have in foreign policy?
I'm sure there's plenty. There's a lot of literature on think tanks. But the reason why I didn't include NGOs or these other interest groups like the ethnic or religious or this kind of interest groups is because I doubt they are writing or talking about European strategic autonomy. And I referred to one poll in the dissertation. It's about how American individuals, do they consider themselves or do they know much about the European Union or Europe? And most of the people there say that they don't know anything about the EU. So that's why I didn't include individuals within the analyzed groups, and pretty much the same with NGOs, that very few talk about European politics, let alone European security and defense. It's mostly the think tanks and some research institutes that talk about it.
Now, I wasn't thinking whether these other interest groups were dealing with strategic autonomy. I just mean in terms of a literature review on scholarship on interest groups in foreign policy, and whether the groups I mentioned are often raised in that academic literature.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, is there a large body focusing on think tanks, or would you be able to make a sort of novel contribution there because you are lifting that into your analysis? That's what I meant.
Yes, okay. I think there is quite a large amount of literature on that. Yes, I think I referred to only a couple on the footnotes. But yeah, it's true. I maybe could have elaborated a bit more on the previous research on think tanks.
Or drawn some conclusions, perhaps, on how this interaction between decision makers and think tanks might look like, perhaps from other issues, but how one could have conceptualized that could have been perhaps a shortcut, true. Because you do conduct quite a few literature reviews in your dissertation. Okay. I'm now going to move on to ask a few questions about the central concepts of your thesis. Yep. And my first questions, not surprisingly, will be about the concept of European strategic autonomy and how that is used in the thesis. That is, how you define and understand this phenomenon that you study perceptions of. And my first question is really, and it's also a little bit, I was sitting looking at your title as well, is European strategic autonomy the same as European security and defense integration?
It's very closely related, but I would say strategic autonomy is kind of a subcategory of European security and defense integration, or very closely linked at least. So just briefly, I define strategic autonomy as the ability to act, make political decisions, and then act upon these political decisions either alone or in cooperation with others. So it's somewhat more narrow than the larger security and defense integration concept. But why I wanted to include both of them in the title or the subtitle is that, like I said, it's not just about strategic autonomy, but how the US has impacted since the Cold War, really, how it has impacted the integration project in Europe, and how the US has always been a really crucial part of European security and defense. And there are even people who say that America is a European power because it's such a central player in European security and defense. So that's why I wanted to also bring up the kind of broader context already in the title.
So when it comes to, I mean, you mentioned European security and defense integration, and I think we often think, oh, that's the EU. But you're also very explicit about the fact that you are not delimiting your focus to the EU. So, but I can't really find a definition of integration, because a lot of what we are seeing at the moment are elements of integration. Actually, I examined a PhD thesis earlier this year in Oslo, which was very much about European security and defense integration. They focused very much on defining integration. So inspired by that, I sort of, how do you define integration, and where is the line between integration and cooperation?
That's a very good question, and it's true. I don't think I explicitly define integration in the dissertation. I think integration is much more profound than cooperation. Cooperation can be quite ad hoc. It can be quite superficial even. Integration is much more institutionalized. It's a long-term process. It doesn't necessarily have a clear goal. For example, when the European integration process or project started in the late 40s, early 50s, I don't think anyone envisioned the European Union that we have today. So it's an ongoing process. It lives in its own time framework. So it's a much more, I mean, integration is a much more profound phenomenon, and also quite unique in the European context. There are many countries that cooperate and are allies, but integration is something much deeper.
But would you say that you would use that term for describing what's happening in NATO?
Integration in NATO.
Would you use that term? Is European defense, security and defense integration something that is applicable to describing what goes on in NATO as well?
I think yes, to a certain extent, not on such a deep level as the European Union, but in a way, yes. Of course, NATO is a bit different because security, defense, and foreign policy is still the responsibility of each nation state. European Union is a bit of a different case because some policy areas individual countries don't have that much say on the policies that they come from the European level. Security and defense is a bit different there. So to a certain extent, yes, I would say that there is some kind of integration, or at least very deep cooperation within NATO, and also these other arrangements that I mentioned, like NORDEFCO and CHEF, for example. But these are still fairly new arrangements, so they are, like I said, they develop through time. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, it's how I've also read your dissertation, that you understand it in that broader sense to also include what's happening when you talk about a European pillar in NATO. I have assumed that had elements of this integration in it. And you provide a really good review of the emergent literature on European strategic autonomy, which is really growing, might not catch much interest in America, but in the European think tanks, but also academically, and not least here in Finland, it's attracting a lot of attention, and you provide a very good overview of that. And you define in chapter 3 two interpretations of European strategic autonomy, what you call the conventional and the global perspective. Could you elaborate what this definition, what purpose it serves in your analysis?
Yeah. The concepts of did I use the word traditional there, or
you used conventional and global.
Conventional, global. Yes, I borrowed these terms from Niklas Helvig, who works here in the in Helsinki, in the FIA, and the way he and I define it is that the conventional understanding of strategic autonomy is the security and defense focused strategic autonomy. So quite a narrow understanding of strategic autonomy, and I think that's how it started, the whole debate on it. But the global understanding, the more modern, if you like, version of strategic autonomy is much more, it's broader, and it also includes policy areas like energy and technology, even climate sometimes, supply chains. Often these also have security and even defense dimensions, but it's perhaps more focused on reducing this kind of unwanted dependencies more globally. It's not just about Europe becoming more independent on the US, but we also talk about dependencies to China, Russia, for example, in the energy policy. Europe used to be very dependent on Russian energy. Now, of course, it has changed. So it's not just about being able to act militarily on its own, but it's Europe becoming more independent of all other this kind of crucial infrastructure and other aspects that we need in modern world.
And that is not included in what you study.
Exactly.
And
yes.
So it serves that purpose, doesn't it, of delimiting what exactly.
Yes. So I do acknowledge the fact that that strategic autonomy is a much broader concept these days, but I decided to narrow down to the security and defense aspects, mostly because, well, this is a dissertation of strategic studies, so I wanted to focus on the security and defense and military aspects.
Now, I can understand the practical reasons why you did it, although I would say that those broader issues, the other type of dependencies that many European countries had, for instance, I mean, the gas pipelines with Russia and so on was a major issue in transatlantic relations. I mean, there were several administrations that banged on about this, that particularly Germany needed to reduce that. So that's been a real sort of talking point in transatlantic relationship.
True. It would have been interesting to include all this.
But I can understand it would have been
also quite interestingly, when I read all these materials that I analyzed, there was very little mentions about any of these, especially in the early 2000s. It was mostly focused on questions of NATO and all these new security and defense structures within the Lisbon Treaty, for example. So these kind of questions were not raised that much in the US, which was quite surprising.
Very interesting. So I want to go on a little bit more about the concept of European strategic autonomy, which I find really interesting. On page 43, you define the concept of European strategic autonomy. Let's see here. And you follow here Timmer's definition of strategic autonomy, which is defined as the member states' willingness to pool their sovereignty and this way strengthen the collective European strategic autonomy. This collective European strategic autonomy is not a goal in itself, which you have repeated many times, but a means to reach the more comprehensive target, and here we come to it, that is strengthening Europe's external role and significant global politics. So, but with this ending, strengthening Europe's external role, and I know you have a whole discussion in your thesis where you make this point that you understand Europe in this broader sense, it's not institutionally dependent, But here, I mean, are you not ending up understanding European strategic autonomy as intrinsically linked to the EU, as many others, like Niklas Helvig, I think, do in their analysis of European strategic autonomy?
That's a real struggle, because it's very difficult to separate or make a clear distinction of the European Union and Europe more broadly. Even more now that almost all European countries are in the European Union, and many of them are also NATO member states. So it's really difficult to define exactly what Europe is and what is the difference between the European Union and Europe more generally speaking. And I admit I did struggle with it sometimes here.
Because it's quite present in the empirical analysis later that in many ways the sort of, if you like, the referent object to this European strategic autonomy is the European Union that you're talking about, I think, in many cases, which is perhaps this formulation that also, or this definition that guides you in that direction of Europe's external role. Well, I mean, I know NORDEFCO I have a great respect for that, but that's not really Europe's external role. It's a contribution to it, but it fits into that sort of wider framework. Then I just have when it comes to the sort of concepts in your dissertation, and it's a more minor one, which I couldn't really understand, is that you, in chapter 6, you talk about theorizing the transatlantic relationship, and you refer to transatlantic relations as a theoretical concept. And I struggle a little bit to see how this really is a theoretical concept rather than a descriptive term or analytical concept at best. Or why did you choose to talk of it as a theoretical concept? I would have thought otherwise that would have been linked into your theory. You often have central concepts in a theory, so I couldn't quite place.
Right. Maybe it's true. Maybe conceptual concept. I'm not even sure if that's a word. Maybe that might have been a better one. But I think the reason why I use that word, I wanted to make a kind of a distinction between the real life phenomenon, transatlantic relations in practice. What is it in practice versus all the theories that researchers have created about transatlantic relations and how they have conceptualized it in the past and in previous literature. But yeah, it's true. Maybe I should have chosen a better word to describe it.
I mean, it makes sense when you talk about theorizing. It's an overview that you do of various scholars theorizing transatlantic relations. But it was this transatlantic relations as a theoretical concept. I mean, transatlantic relations, can be defined as a concept of a type of relationship, that consists of certain characteristics that would make it a sort of analytical concept, but it's not in itself. It's an instance of a phenomenon.
True.
So it's just I got a bit confused what you meant.
I think that's also slightly related to the very short discussion that I have about if transatlantic relations if it's a security community or is it a political community. So there may be some theoretical discussion as well.
Yeah, I'll come back to the security community idea, but that will be later on in the discussion. Moving on, methods and research design. You adopt in your thesis a qualitative methodology that is explicitly, as we've now heard several times, inductive, and also, I would argue, largely constructivist in its methodology. Now, given the theory, and here I will return to this again, for your thesis, and we have partly talked about it, I suppose, but why did you choose this research design when neoclassical, in some ways, as you point to, actually have elements of, it's in a way it's a middle ground position between positivism and constructivism. But at the end of the day, it is a theory that is largely deductive in its approach, and terminology is clearly positivistic. They talk about independent, dependent, and intervening variables. That's very sort of positivist terminology. And I still struggle a little bit with the two here. I mean, didn't the theory persuade you to abandon the inductive approach?
Well, here we come again to the fact that in my case the neoclassical realism, it in a way offered me the framework from which I approached the material that I analyzed, and it allowed me to narrow down the vast amount of data into these two intervening variables. I did consider the other options as well, and I do recognize the kind of discrepancy between a realist theoretical tradition and more constructive method, but I still think that neoclassical realism does offer the scope for this. If I had chosen a neorealist theoretical framework, then perhaps it wouldn't work that well. But I think neoclassical realism, especially the way that I defined and used it, it still works quite well with my methods and analysis methods.
Yeah, because reading your dissertation, it's almost like it's a stark choice that you have to make between a deductive and inductive research strategies to your work. But I really think that the majority of research actually most of the time falls in between these two different approaches and research strategies in what some would say is an abductive approach. It combines elements of the two, because that's the nature of the research process. There's always elements of induction. If you have any ambition and openness to exploring new phenomena, it is an inductive element. But theory, as we talked about earlier, are these sort of tools of analysis. So there is a certain element of analytical deduction involved, at least in terms of certain theoretical expectations. You talk a lot about sort of prior assumptions that we have in research. And using a theory also helps you being very explicit about the assumptions you as a researcher have. You can actually declare them. These are my assumptions. So you're very transparent about it. And I just sort of think that can be quite helpful when you do research. And in a way, I sort of feel you struggled a little bit in your sort of empirical work, because yes, you chose your two groups, but it didn't really help you in the sort of coding process, which leads me over to this question about if you can describe a bit more, how the coding was conducted for the empirical analysis, because it seems to me that you were very open here, and that was an ambition that you have, and I think that's very admirable, and I think I can see why you therefore used a thematic analysis that you arrived at, and has certainly generated interested results. But you also conducted a lot of literature reviews, and I would have thought that some of those reviews and what you learned from studying previous research would help you to at least perhaps do a preliminary type of coding book or questions that you ask towards the material. Doesn't mean that you slavishly abide to that, but it's a starting point for doing research. And as I see it, it often involves doing, piloting. You start, okay, how does this work on the empirical material? Doesn't work, need to expand it, need to leave that out. And actually, the beauty of doing that would mean that you would actually be able to, some kind of code book could evolve that you could demonstrate is a further development in the field. The sort of cumulative ambition we always have with what we do in academia. And Did you think of using it in that sort of way?
Perhaps not in that elaborate way, but I did use some of the previous research and literature review before I started the coding process.
Yeah.
And for example, I found out in the previous literature that there's a lot of focus on the fears and anxieties in the US that they have towards European strategic autonomy. So that was kind of a underlying assumption in a way that I had, that I have to look for indications of this, but I also knew that it's not just black and white, that it's either or in the US discussion. That's why I wanted to have quite an open mind when I was doing the first readings and the coding of the material. And like I've mentioned many times here, let the material tell its story. So I didn't want to restrict myself too much with previous literature either. But of course, by that time I had written quite a lot and read a lot on the topic, so of course I had some kind of an idea what to look for.
Yeah. Okay, time is pressing, so I will move on now to talking a little bit about the data that you use, and it really is a very impressive selection of primary material that you cover in this dissertation, covering 25 years. And I admire that you're very transparent in discussing the selection of this material. The thesis contains several appendices where you're very clear about listing all this material, listing these different types of research institutes and think tanks and their ideological sort of grounding and so on. But I want to ask a few questions about your reflections on the use of this material. So first, when you analyzed the group of decision makers that included speeches and statements, did you consider the context and audience within which these were made? And the reason I'm asking this question is that I do think that really matters, because speeches are often crafted for particular audiences. And it really matters because, if it's in a domestic context, obviously you are addressing a domestic audience with their concerns. Or if you're abroad, the country that you visit matters. And I think you illustrate this in your dissertation because you make the point about Trump's more positive statements about transatlantic relations when he was on a state visit to Poland, I think 2019.
I think it was in a war memorial or something like that.
And very sort of positive. So that was included in your sort of analysis. But it does really illustrate this point that speeches and statements are often made in a particular context. So it's very important to think about, have I got a balance in the material of where these statements, speeches are being made in order to not get a bias in the interpretation of that?
That's exactly true, and I did consider this quite a lot. And obviously, because most of the material that I collected was from state visits or when the presidents and ministers or secretaries were in NATO or visiting the EU. And usually those are the occasions when they do talk about European strategic autonomy and European defense in general. It's not like someday they just go to the podium and start talking about European security and defense for no reason. That it always has to happen in a context where it's relevant. So yes, it's true that it doesn't perhaps give a very detailed very detailed understanding of what the American presidents and secretaries of defense and so on, what they actually really think, or is it just polite words that they say? But I did include, for example, some articles that I think it was Condoleezza Rice that had written in foreign policy before she was in the cabinet of Bush. So we can see there some glimpses of when they were perhaps more free to say what they really think. But this is also one reason why I perhaps should have included some interviews in the analysis material, because that may have given me some glimpses to the kind of what the people really think. But on the other hand, I doubt I could have been able to interview President Clinton, for example. So, and even his closest circle, I doubt I could have had the chance to do that. So I'm not sure it would have really helped me that much.
But because that was actually my other question about interviews, why you didn't conduct interviews. And yes, I can understand that perhaps the top brass of decision making, but you do include also advisors, and they are more approachable, and many of them will have been, you know, not active and maybe quite keen to talk. So is that not something that you sort of still entertained? And I mean, it's not just decision makers, but it's also I mean, I'm thinking of the foreign policy influencers to have more in-depth discussions about what you found.
Yes, I did consider that, but especially with the foreign policy influencers, I noticed that they seem to have very few arguments. They tell them often and very loud, but they have a couple of talking points that they repeat every single time. For example, some of the influencers published 3 or 4 comment pieces in different papers, and they were practically identical. So sure, I could have perhaps approached them and asked for an interview, but I'm not sure how much they could have added something new. And also some of those people that were foreign policy influencers in the 1990s, they may be retired, they may have no interest whatsoever in these questions anymore. So it's also because of the 25-year period of time that I analyze, it also poses this kind of challenges.
Yes, and of course, a few of the years in your PhD research was also during COVID, wasn't it?
That's
so
true.
That's also
Obviously, I could have done it via Zoom or something.
Yeah,
but
yes, yeah. But you, we talked a bit here now about the policy influences, and I do have a question about them as well, because you were very clear earlier saying that you're not really interested in individuals. But when I read your analysis of these policy influences and the way you quote them, it's often individuals that you quote rather than the organization. So I wonder how you treat them and their statements and their reports and so on in terms of representatives of organizations, and why you then wouldn't clump them together as a cohesive lot, because it was a bit challenging, I found, in the empirical analysis, both to keep track on all the different institutes, but also all the different people that you mentioned. And also, I mean, I looked at the list, which is very good that you listed all the people, but, you know, there's certain people in that list that also made me think of who they are as individuals and representatives of these policy think tanks. For instance, Sally McNamara. I mean, she's originally of the Heritage Foundation. I mean, I think she's British by origin. I think she's American citizen today, but she has that sort of background. I wonder if that matters. You also include Sven Bishop, who is linked to the Atlantic Council Strategic Advisory Group, but he is primarily a Belgian professor at the Egmont Institute in Brussels. So I'm just sort of thinking how you were treating these different foreign policy influences as a group.
Yes. I'll first start with the individual word. I think previously when I said that I'm not interested in the individuals, I mainly meant like public, the general public. I probably used the word individual, but yeah, I'm sorry, that was confusing. But as for individuals, I didn't want to discuss too much their backgrounds and personalities, because I think it would be almost intruding in a way to discuss people's even personal life and very personal views in a dissertation like this. So that's why I wanted to look at them mainly as representatives of their organizations. Perhaps I should have discussed a bit more how, for example, the Heritage Foundation, how it's inclined. Is it a conservative or liberal or whatever? On the other hand, in the Appendix 4, I do briefly discuss or like give just a kind of overview of how these different think tanks and research institutes are politically inclined, like here Heritage Foundation, conservative, and then references. So in a way you can check from the Appendix 3 an individual where he or she worked at the time, and then check how that institute is if it's what is its kind of political orientation.
I think it would have been quite nice in the analysis if you had used it more as a sort of these individuals talking as the sort of representation of the institutes, because it was the way it was presented in the text is very much reference to also quite often to certain individuals. So I also think, well, are there diversity within, the Heritage Foundation, or is it, that some of these people are more strident and vocal than others? So what is their representation of the institute as a whole, if you're thinking of them as a collective? Because there was a certain tension there, I felt.
Yeah, it was a bit of a balancing act also, because sometimes their articles, for example, were not published on the institute website, but they were writing as individuals for some other paper, and it just said in the end, this and this person works for this and this organization. So it's kind of a balancing if it's the institute's voice that speaks or an individual on a personal capacity.
Okay, I now want to move on to the analysis and results of the dissertation. And as I said before, it's very impressive analysis of 25 years of European transatlantic relations. And before I get into the thematic analysis, I just want to ask you briefly a question about the organization in this part 3 of your thesis and the logic for structuring the empirical analysis as you did into 3 chapters. First, there's 2 parts or chapters that present a more descriptive temporal analysis before you get to the thematic analysis.
Shall I?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Please
Sorry.
do.
Yes, so in chapters 9 and 10, I wanted to have a kind of a historical overview of all these years that I analyzed, so from 1998 to 2022. Originally, I hadn't even thought about writing chapter 11, which is the thematic analysis, but quite soon when I started writing chapters 9 and 10, I realized that I cannot include everything in these 2 chapters, that it was better to have a more chronological overview of what has happened in European security and defense and in transatlantic relations, and then later talk about what I actually found out in this analysis and what were the themes and topics that I discovered. And the decision to divide the chronological analysis into 2 chapters was just for practical reasons, not to have a 100-page chapter that no one would want to read. And I decided to use year 2014 as a kind of a line there between these 2 chapters. I think 2014 is quite a natural year to break these 2 chapters, because that's when the Crimean invasion and annexation happened, and that's when Europe finally realized that it has to do more, and there's that Russia's aggression really materialized. So that's kind of a watershed moment in European security and defense. So that's why I thought it was a good place to start.
No, it's just that it sort of wondered whether you could have written that in a more effective way to integrate the thematic analysis with it, because sometimes there's a bit of repetition of the different presidencies and so on.
I did consider that, but in the
and
end
it would also, I think, enhance the sort of the analytical depth of these chapters, which are really interesting. I really enjoyed reading them, and it's a really good sort of overview of these sort of years, and also in a way that you bring in the context in which these American responses to discussions in Europe take place. And I think that's very important contribution of your thesis. But on that point, I just want to ask you to go back to this about Europe, what do you mean by that, and European strategic autonomy in a broad sense. And the fact that you understand Europe as not the EU and institutionally dependent, and therefore opening it up to formats like the Nordic Defence Cooperation. But I do find in these two chapters that there is quite little of the broader view of Europe included. There are some references to member states, such as the pivotal role of France and the United Kingdom, and their sort of agreement to start cooperating on defence policy within the EU, the so-called Saint-Malo agreement. But one thing I would, and this perhaps is, again, I'm a little bit biased. I once upon a time wrote my PhD, which was on Britain, France, and Germany, and European security and defence cooperation. And what was very clear in that, in my dissertation, was these competing visions of European security order between these countries, between the transatlantic visions of a European security order, symbolized very much by the UK, France, the independent independence, independent Europe, deep roots going back to de Gaulle, and then you find Germany in between these two. I called it the spagat between these two visions, and it's not only those countries, but Poland is one which clearly sides on one, others on the other, and you have this very deep division within Europe and within the European Union, but that's not very present in your analysis, I think.
That's true.
And I think that's a little bit of a missed opportunity, seeing as you make a big point of seeing Europe in this looser form.
Yes, I do understand your point there. I think the reason why that is that in the material that I studied, there's very little discussion on these other arrangements like the NORDEFCO or JEF or the bilateral relations. Actually, I think that one of the few references to bilateral relations where the UK-US relations, the special relationship between them, and how the US was very worried that its special relationship with the US, or UK, was in peril because of the European security and defense integration efforts. Perhaps I could have kind of broadened my material and start looking for these aspects that you just mentioned, but because my main interest was on how the US discusses strategic autonomy from their own perspective. It's true that I have a very broad understanding of it, but it became quite clear to me that in America, in the US, the definition of strategic autonomy is much more narrow than my personal definition of it. So that's also one reason why I did not include that kind of aspects.
It's only that your analysis is about, to a large extent, it's very, the US being responsive to what happens in Europe. And there are deep divisions in Europe on what European strategic autonomy is. I've read some policy papers coming out from Poland which are very critical of the whole concept of European strategic autonomy, and I'm sure it can also be found in other countries. So obviously that's an important part in the sort of US deliberations and thinking about European strategic autonomy. And I'm even thinking about Germany, which is, I think, a really fascinating country to study. But I remember, for instance, during the Clinton years, I know you start from 98, so it might not be so relevant. I think that was perhaps more in his first term. He made a big play on Germany, a unified Germany. I think he made his first visit to Europe to Germany, and he used the phrase, you know, we want to establish equal partnership with Germany. And France, I think the French were quite miffed about this because it was very bilateral, and it was, you know, really challenging French views about their own sort of sense of leadership. But I think Germany is very interesting, but perhaps that hasn't come up.
It didn't really come up. Perhaps if I had, like I said, broadened the analyzed material, maybe something could have come up, or if I had studied or analyzed speeches that the presidents gave when visiting Germany, for example. I do remember one speech that I analyzed by Clinton that was in Germany, but again the focus was more on the current developments in Europe more broadly, not just in one country.
And another question I have, which perhaps also could have been a bit more clearer in the analysis, is the distinction between areas of security and defense integration that concerns really Article 5. In other words, sort of territorial defense commitments, alliance commitment, and non-Article 5 issues that concerns the more crisis management, which arguably, you know, has really been the energy and focus mainly within the EU, but also EU, NATO, EU, US discussions. But this doesn't really figure much in your analysis when you talk about European strategic autonomy, attaching, you know, when it's concerning Europe's ability to act without the US, in many cases have been these non-Article 5. That's really where I think there was a role expectations of the Europeans to contribute more. And the reason why I think Tony Blair went along with, you know, bringing in defense questions within the European Union, because it was the only vehicle in which you could mobilize Europeans to start contributing. But this doesn't figure much in your analysis, or?
Yeah, that's true. I do not make a clear distinction between the different aspects within strategic autonomy. I don't really talk about that much about civilian crisis management or military crisis management versus this kind of Article 5 defense. Perhaps I should have, but I think one reason for that is that the whole concept of strategic autonomy has been so vague for so many years, and it's been quite difficult to define whether it is about crisis management, whether it's about the kind of Article 5 defense. It depends on the context, depends on the person who's speaking, how they understand it. So it's quite a very complex.
No, I realize it must be. And then another, which is not a criticism in any way, it's more a reflection when reading this, which is that because you bring up this concept of security community, which is really a concept that is used in sort of liberal theory, originally coined by Karl Deutsch. At certain times, early 1990s, I think was a very popular concept to describe transatlantic relationship. And it's a perspective where, you know, liberal theorists will often emphasize the role of ideas and institutions. And I'm thinking of what you said at the beginning, that you were interested in transatlantic relationship because it was about this shared sense of identity and culture across the Atlantic. And would you agree that it is the case that this sense of community, which is not very present in the analysis, is actually on the decline in transatlantic relations? Or do you see reference to that shared sense of, you know, shared values, a common, perhaps Western identity, that kind of thing in your material?
It's really interesting because to a certain extent, it is still a very strong community, and I think one example of how that is because Finland and Sweden wanted to join that community. They felt that that's the best community for them to be part of, that it makes them more secure. But then at the same time, we have countries like Turkey in NATO or Hungary, that's maybe more in the EU, but anyway, countries that kind of fight back. They don't, you know, perhaps they do want to be part of that community, but the way that they behave in international relations, it's kind of against the ideas of this kind of community where, you know, of course, countries don't need to agree on everything. It's NATO is a organization or institution of democratic countries, and dialogue and debate is part of democracy and this kind of organization. So it's natural that they don't agree on everything, but still the kind of ultimate goal should be that they debate and then they stand together.
So I want to now quickly move on to the thematic analysis and the results which it generated, which I think these four interesting types of perception of European strategic autonomy among policy influences. So America as a European power and European NATO, meaning European defense more through NATO, and then autonomous Europe, lightest possible US footprint, meaning European defense through European solutions. Now, when it comes to American decision makers, you don't find this, what you call multivocality of views. And indeed, you find more stability of views over time, or that these sort of views of opportunities and threats are much more coexist along this time, despite the turbulent years of Trump that is included in your analysis. So that's, I think, is a very interesting finding. Now, I want to push you a bit on the conclusions you draw from this for your analysis. I mean, both in terms of what role policy influences have on decision makers in US foreign policy, and also if you could reflect a little, if I could encourage you to reflect a little bit on how you interpret these four types of perceptions from a neoclassical realist analysis, if you're thinking about the sort of systemic level factors and the domestic, what it says about that.
Yes, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you there because that's clearly the weakness of my analysis, that it's not so much connected to the neoclassical realist framework. Like I said earlier, it was quite a difficult task to integrate them in a way, or create dialogue between them. I'm quite happy with the analysis otherwise, but honestly, yeah, I could have or should have created more discussion between these two.
Because I think what I'm really trying, and this is my sort of final point on the sort of conclusions of that you draw, is I find very interesting that there is this multivocality, and then there's this stability, and that's a really growing topic in academic research really sparked off, I think, by the war in Ukraine. How do we understand foreign policy change? And, you know, in countries like Finland and Sweden, it's certainly a very important topic. And here, I think it's also very interesting that there is this element of stability of views that you find among American decision makers. So I just want you to reflect on that, and how can we explain that, this stability of views over time, because a neo-realist assumption, a neoclassical realist assumption is, of course, the real independent variable is this international system and the change that will impact foreign policy. Now, the intervening variables will mean certain delays, but at the end of the day, that's the real causal factor. Now, you're looking at 25 years of stability, during which time we go from unipolar moment of US power to a much more multipolar world. So here we have real changes at the international system, but then we have this sort of stability. How do we explain that?
I think it can be explained by states and organizations wanting to maintain the status quo, the current state of affairs in a way, and survive in the system, maintain their position, maintain their power and influence. And obviously, I'm sure if I had a chance to look inside the Oval Office and what has been actually discussed there, it must look more turbulent and not as stable, maybe. But when politicians go out and speak publicly, they want to emphasize that nothing is changing. Our foreign policy line is not changing. We stand by our allies. We stand by our commitments. Of course, there are changes sometimes. I think in the US, it usually comes when there's a transition of power. And of course, these forces in the systemic level, like the rise of China, it has changed the foreign policy directions of the US in the past 25 years. But ultimately, every country tries to maintain its status and its role in world politics.
I think this is, in your continued research, building on this excellent dissertation, I think that's one that you could really push ahead on and build on the work you've done here and the very interesting finding from that. So I now come actually to my final question, which is more of a sort of policy relevant one, because I think this dissertation does not only speak to academics, it's a PhD thesis, of course, but I think will be a really interesting read for policy practitioners as well. So, has a very high external policy relevance. Now, if we consider this group of sort of policy relevant people, what are the main takeaways from your thesis that you would like to highlight and share with them? And what are the implications of your research findings for how Europe can achieve strategic autonomy without antagonizing the US, given that it is still play this critical role for European security and defense?
Yeah. Yes, I really hope that civil servants and other practitioners do read at least the conclusions and notice that the debate is much more complex and much more multivocal in the US than we often think here in Europe. We often think that it's either or, that the US either supports European strategic autonomy or is against it. But I think it's really important to understand the nuances and the sometimes hidden messages that can be revealed when you actually have time to analyze these different comments and speeches and reports. So hopefully in Europe we will understand the US a little bit better because of this and take into consideration different actors, organizations who work in the field. And as for actually implementing the ideas of strategic autonomy. Well, there are a lot of strategies and papers coming from the EU especially. I hope that they are also implemented and that they are not just this kind of what the Americans often call paper tiger, but that they actually would have an impact. And doing this, transparency is key when talking with the US to make clear that the ideas of strategic autonomy, they are not against the US, they're not against NATO, but it's kind of expanding the scope and that Europe that is strategically more autonomous and more capable, it also benefits the US because that allows US to focus on other areas, especially Asia and China, and hopefully it would balance the relationship between Europe and the US in a positive way, balancing.
Well, thank you very much, Heljä,
Thank you.
for all your answers. I've really enjoyed our discussions. I think now a sufficient amount of the topics has been covered. So I want to now move to my concluding statement of this public examination. It's nice to be standing up after all this time. Okay, so this is my overall statement. As the opponent appointed by the Scientific Research Council of the National Defense University, I have examined the dissertation of the doctoral candidate Heljä Ossa in this public examination. My statement consists of 4 main parts. First, I discuss the overall scientific significance of the dissertation in relation to the identified research problem. Next, I review the theoretical framework and methodological research design, followed by an assessment of the empirical findings. And finally, I conclude by examining the strengths and weaknesses of the PhD thesis and assessing its contribution to the scholarship on US foreign policy and transatlantic relations. So, in terms of scientific significance, the thesis addresses a significant research problem, understanding how various actors within the US political system, specifically decision makers and foreign policy influencers, perceive European strategic autonomy and defense integration. The central question it explores is whether the evolving European frameworks of security and defense cooperation and integration are viewed by US policy elites as a threat or an opportunity for NATO and the US more broadly. And although there is extensive European leadership on European security and defense integration, the literature examining US perspectives of these European developments is scant. This dissertation, therefore, addresses an important gap in the literature and makes a significant empirical contribution to our understanding of the dynamics in European-US transatlantic relations since the end of the Cold War in the fields of strategic studies and international relations. The thesis utilizes the theory of neoclassical realism to frame the study and to justify its analytical focus, arguing that systemic level factors in foreign policy are crucially mediated by domestic intervening variables, such as the perceptions of foreign policy decision makers and influencers. The thesis explicitly states that its aim is not to develop or test theory, I think we have made that clear, but rather to employ it to frame the object of study. And although the candidate demonstrates excellent knowledge of the theoretical traditions and debates within realism, particularly neoclassical realism, the lack of theoretical ambition is a missed opportunity. For instance, to conceptualize more precisely the role of think tanks in the policy-making process vis-à-vis decision makers could have been a significant contribution. While the thesis provides for an insightful discussion of ontology and epistemology, thereby positioning the research approach, it remains unclear what purpose the theory serves, given that it neither guides nor informs the empirical study, specifically in understanding why US policymakers and influencers hold particular views on European strategic autonomy. The thesis employs a qualitative and inductive research design, although it is not clear how this aligns with the theory of neoclassical realism. Despite this, the methodology is thoroughly discussed, demonstrating a commendable level of transparency in outlining the various steps taken in the research process, including data collection, coding, and the construction of the thematic analysis. The data collection process is comprehensive and it's meticulously detailed in the appendices of the thesis. The method is characterized as a thematic content analysis, involving an inductive search for patterns of meaning within the data. It could be argued that the constructivist philosophy underpinning this approach conflicts with the positivist methodology typically associated with neoclassical realism. Additionally, the 5 research questions presented at the beginning of the thesis would have benefited from further discussion and operationalization in the methods chapter. The central concept of European strategic autonomy is descriptively defined and delineated through a literature review of previous research contributing valuable insights. However, this definition does not sufficiently inform the analysis, leading to a certain conceptual ambiguity regarding the specific phenomenon the empirical study seeks to capture and investigate, that is, what exactly the US perceptions are an expression of and response to. The main strength and primary contribution of this thesis, as I see it, lies in its empirical study, which offers an extensive analysis of US perceptions of European security and defense developments over a 25-year period, from 1998 to 2022. It is a systematic study combining historical overview of the evolution of transatlantic relations, highlighting key developments in European defense integration and US grant strategy, with a temporal descriptive analysis in 2 chapters of US perceptions on European strategic autonomy. These parts constitute the foundation for conducting the thematic analysis of American perceptions as held by decision makers and policy influences of European strategic autonomy. The analysis of the complexity and multivocality of the American debate on European strategic autonomy is skillfully conducted and condensed into key themes emerging from the material. Unsurprisingly, it shows more diversity among foreign policy influences, but it's interesting that the various US administrations demonstrate such a high level of stability of views of transatlantic relations and European strategic autonomy. Given that there have been significant shifts in international power relations during this time period, from the unipolar moment of US power to the multipolarity exhibited today, this is a puzzle that a neoclassical realist analysis effectively could have engaged with. Concluding remarks. This dissertation demonstrates commendable coherence and a focused approach in addressing the central research problem. The study effectively explores how decision makers and foreign policy influencers perceive European strategic autonomy and defense integration, yielding significant findings. Notably, it reveals that while views vary, US concerns regarding European strategic autonomy are primarily centered on its implications for NATO rather than a fear of Europe balancing directly against the United States. These empirical findings make a substantial contribution to scholarly debates within strategic studies and international relations concerning the emergence of European defense integration and transatlantic security relations. The thesis reflects that the candidate has attained deep knowledge of scholarly debates and detailed knowledge of US-European transatlantic security relations. The work presented attains a good academic standard and is eloquently written. So, as a conclusion, I will propose to the National Defense University that this dissertation be accepted.
Thank you very much for all your valuable comments, Professor Agesta. You have made several useful points and improvement suggestions, and also suggestions for further research, which I appreciate a lot. Now, if anyone present wishes to make comments or questions concerning my dissertation, please ask the custos for the floor. Mikäli yleisön joukossa on henkilöitä, jotka haluavat esittää kysymyksiä väitöskirjaani liittyen, pyydän heitä varaamaan kustokselta puheenvuoron.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you now indeed have an opportunity to pose questions for the candidates. And if you follow this event online, you can send your questions to Maanpuolustuskorkeakoulu at mil.fi. And we'll wait for a few moments for possible online questions. Eli arvoisa yleisö, nyt teillä on mahdollisuus esittää kysymyksiä tutkielman tekijälle. Etäyhteyksien äärellä olevat katsojat voivat lähettää kysymyksiä osoitteeseen maanpuolustuskorkeakoulu@mil.fi. Ja vietämme muutaman rattoisan hetken odottelemalla mahdollisia etäkysymyksiä. Paikan päälläkin saa toki mieluusti kysyä, jos joku tahtoo. I don't see any questions online. Emme ole saaneet ilmeisestikään etäkysymyksiä. Joten let me inform you now that any official observations about this dissertation or this examination shall be made to the National Defense University within 2 weeks from now. Those who wish to file such an official remark concerning this dissertation or its defense, please raise your hand now. Otherwise you will lose your right to make such an observation. Mikäli joku haluaa tehdä virallisen huomautuksen väitöskirjaan liittyen, tulee sitä ilmoittaa nyt tässä tilaisuudessa ja jättää huomautuksensa 2 viikon kuluttua tästä päivämäärästä. Anyone willing to file a remark? Tahtooko joku jättää huomautuksen? I don't see any raised hands, which makes me very glad at the same time.
Me too.
Since there seems to be no one willing to file a remark, koska kukaan ei halua jättää huomautusta, I hereby declare this examination closed. Julistan väitöstilaisuuden päättyneeksi.